In the last 3 years, something unprecedented has happened. Central banks around the world have bought over 3,000 tons of gold. That's more than the previous decade combined. But here's what should terrify you. 198 tons of those purchases were made by institutions who refused to reveal their identity. Think about that for a second. The most transparent financial institutions in the world, central banks, are suddenly buying gold in secret and won't tell anyone who they are. Someone is preparing for something, and they're doing it in the shadows. Now, before I show you exactly who's buying, how much they're accumulating, and why this should concern every person holding dollars, let me take you back to a moment that changed everything, a promise that was broken 53 years ago, and why what's happening right now is almost an exact replay of that crisis. Except this time, the consequences could be far more severe. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand what the smartest money in the world is preparing for. You'll see the pattern they're following, and more importantly, you'll know what it means for your savings, your retirement, and the dollar in your bank account. Let's go back to where this all started. The original sin, the Bretton Woods promise. Picture this. It's July 1944. World War II is still raging across Europe and the Pacific. And inside the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 730 delegates from 44 nations are gathering in a gilded ballroom. Harry Dexter White is representing the U.S. Treasury Department. John Maynard Keynes is speaking for a bankrupt British Empire. And together, these men are designing the financial architecture that will govern the entire post-war world. The agreement they forged that summer seems beautifully simple, almost elegant. The dollar will be as good as gold, at $35 per ounce. Every other currency in the world will peg to the dollar, and America's gold in Fort Knox, all 20,000 tons of it guaranteed. The entire system works. For the first time in history, one nation's currency becomes the backbone of global trade, not because of conquest, but because of trust. The world believes in America's promise. It's brilliant. It's revolutionary. And it has a fatal flaw built right into its foundation. Here's where the cracks begin to show. And I promise you, by the end of this section, you'll see the exact same cracks appearing in today's system. Fast forward to December 1958. The dollar becomes fully convertible for international transactions. What this means is that foreign central banks can now walk up to the U.S. Treasury and exchange their dollars for actual, physical gold. At this exact moment, foreign entities hold $19.4 billion in dollar claims against the United States, but Fort Knox contains only $22.8 billion worth of gold at the official price. Do you see the problem here? The margin is razor thin. There's barely enough gold to back the promises we've made. And the entire world is about to figure that out. The French Rebellion then comes February 4, 1965. French President Charles de Gaulle holds a press conference at the Élysée Palace in Paris. And what he announces on live television changes everything. De Gaulle declares that France will begin converting its dollar reserves to gold. He stands there, in front of the world's cameras, and calls America's special currency status an exorbitant privilege. He's essentially saying, you print paper, we send you real goods, and somehow you get to run deficits forever while we accumulate your paper promises. This is not fair, and we're done playing this game. And then, France literally sends naval ships across the Atlantic Ocean to collect gold bars from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Over the next 3 years, France ships 191 million to the United States and receives actual gold bars in return. They load those bars onto ships and sail them back to Paris. Germany watches this happen, and quietly they start doing the same thing. Spain follows. Switzerland joins in. The gold is hemorrhaging out of Fort Knox, flowing back across the Atlantic to Europe, and there's nothing the United States can do to stop it without breaking our promise. Now, pause here for just a second, because what I'm about to show you is the exact moment that connects directly to what's happening right now in 2024. The pattern is almost identical. The crisis point, May 1971, becomes the breaking point. Germany's central bank, the Bundesbank, converts $1 billion worth of dollars into gold in a single week. Let that sink in. $1 billion. In 1 week. The drain is completely unsustainable. Fort Knox now holds roughly 8,100 tons of gold. But foreign dollar claims exceed $80 billion. At the official price of $35 per ounce, that means foreign countries are holding claims worth nearly 3 times the value of all the gold we actually have. We're running out. And everyone knows it. In a closed-door meeting at Camp David on August 13, 1971, Treasury Secretary John Connally tells President Nixon something terrifying. We're going to run out of gold. And when we do, the entire system collapses. Nixon has a choice. Keep the promise and watch Fort Knox empty completely, or break the promise and hope the world accepts it. The break the Nixon shock 2 days later, August 15, 1971, at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. President Richard Nixon appears on television screens across America. In a 9-minute address, he announces, I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. He says it's temporary. He says it's necessary to protect America from international speculators. He says the system will stabilize and everything will return to normal. Notice that word, temporarily. 53 years later, that temporary suspension is still in place. The gold window never reopened. Within 72 hours, the price of gold begins climbing. By 1973, major currencies are floating freely against each other. The fixed exchange rate system is dead. By 1980, gold hits $800 per ounce, a 200% increase from the official Bretton Woods price. But here's what actually matters about that night. In 1971, central bankers in London, Paris, Bonn, Tokyo, and Beijing learned something they would never, ever forget. Never fully trust another nation's currency as your sole reserve asset, no matter how powerful that nation appears. For 27 years, the United States promised that dollars were as good as gold. And then, when tested, when countries actually showed up to collect, we changed the rules. That lesson went quiet for decades. The dollar remained dominant. America's military guaranteed global trade routes. The petrodollar system reinforced dollar demand. Network effects made the dollar indispensable. But that lesson never disappeared. It sat quietly in the institutional memory of central banks, from Beijing to Warsaw, from Moscow to New Delhi, waiting for the right moment to express itself. And in 2022, that moment arrived with explosive force. But before we get there, you need to see what happened in between, because the pattern reveals exactly what's coming next. The reversal, the selling era. For nearly 3 decades after Nixon closed the gold window, central banks treated gold like an embarrassing relic from a bygone era. They weren't buying it. They were actively selling it. May 7, 1999, Gordon Brown, Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, announces that the Bank of England will sell 395 tons of gold, more than half of what Britain is holding. The sales happen between July 1999 and March 2002. Britain gets an average price of $275 per ounce. The total proceeds, approximately $3.5 billion. The financial press applauds the move as modern and sophisticated. Economists argue that gold is a barbarous relic. Why hold a non-yielding metal when you could hold interest-bearing government bonds instead? Today, that's it. 395 tons of gold would be worth over $24 billion. Britain lost $20 billion in opportunity cost because Gordon Brown believed the conventional wisdom that gold was dead. History now calls this moment Brown's bottom, because gold begins a decade-long rally almost immediately after the sales end. But here's what's fascinating about this period. Just 4 months after Brown's announcement, on September 26, 1999, 15 European central banks signed something called the Washington Agreement on Gold. The European Central Bank, Germany's Bundesbank, France's Banque de France, and yes, even the Bank of England, all pledged to limit their collective gold sales to 400 tons per year for 5 years. Now, most analysts interpret this as coordinated selling. But look closer. It's actually a ceiling, not a target. What they're really signaling is that unlimited, panicked selling is over. The Bundesbank holds 3,469 tons. The Banque de France holds 3,024 tons. They're not dumping gold anymore. They're managing it carefully, deliberately. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, central banks collectively sell an average of 400 to 500 tons every single year. The conventional wisdom says gold is a dead asset in a world of sophisticated financial engineering, rising stock markets, and technological innovation. The great financial crisis changes everything. Then 2008 arrives. And it changes everything. The global financial system nearly collapses that fall. Lehman Brothers fails on September 15th. AIG needs emergency rescue. Bear Stearns is absorbed by JP Morgan. The entire commercial paper market freezes. The United States injects $700 billion through the TAR program. But that's just the beginning. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, they all launch quantitative easing programs that will eventually total over $9 trillion in printed money. Interest rates drop to zero and stay there for nearly a decade. Government debt explodes as nations borrow to stabilize their economies. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio climbs past 100%. Japan's exceeds 200%. Even Germany, famous for fiscal discipline, starts running deficits, and central bank governors around the world start asking themselves a question they haven't seriously considered in decades. What happens if the bonds we're holding become worthless? What backs our reserves if the debt can't be repaid? The first signals. April 2009 brings the first major signal of what's coming. China reveals that it has been quietly accumulating gold. Its reported reserves jump from 600 tons unchanged since 2003 to 1,054 tons. That's a 75% increase. And it happened in silence. No announcements, no press releases, just a quiet line item update in an IMF report. But here's the pattern you need to understand. China announces the increases in batches years after the purchases actually happen. By 2015, they announce another jump to 1,658 tons. But Western analysts who track Swiss gold export data, because Switzerland refines most of the world's gold, and Shanghai Gold Exchange withdrawal data, estimate the real number is far, far higher, possibly 4,000 tons or more, held through state-owned banks and sovereign wealth funds that don't report to the IMF. The great reversal then comes 2010, and everything flips. For the first time in 2 decades, central banks collectively become net buyers of gold. They purchase 77 tons that year. In 2011, they buy 457 tons. And here's what matters most. The buying never stops again. Russia's central bank starts adding 200 tons or more annually from 2014 through 2018. The People's Bank of China officially adds over 100 tons a year whenever they bother to report it. India's Reserve Bank purchases 200 tons in 2009 directly from the IMF in a single massive transaction. Turkey's central bank adds 313 tons combined in just 2017 and 2018. Let me explain the mechanism here because it's important. Central banks hold foreign exchange reserves. These are assets that back their currencies and are available for international transactions. Traditionally, they kept these reserves in U.S. Treasury bonds, German government bonds, Japanese government bonds, basically debt from stable countries. After 2008, with interest rates near zero, massive money printing everywhere, and debt to GDP ratios soaring past 100% in every major economy, central banks begin shifting a portion of these reserves into gold. They buy through commercial banks, through the London Bullion Market Association, or directly from gold-producing nations. The purchases often aren't announced immediately. They show up months later in quarterly IMF reports or national balance sheets. And here's the key insight. Gold requires no counterparty. It can't default. It can't be sanctioned. And it can't be printed into worthlessness. You're trading yield-bearing but potentially risky foreign debt for a non-yielding but indestructible asset. Retention hook, but nothing. And I mean absolutely nothing prepared the world for what happened in 2022. This is where the story becomes genuinely alarming. The acceleration. The $300 billion lesson. February 24th, 2022. Russia invades Ukraine. The world watches in shock as tanks roll across the border and missiles strike Kyiv. But what happens next changes the global monetary system forever. Within 72 hours, the United States, European Union, United Kingdom, Canada, and allies freeze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. Read that again. $300 billion. Roughly half of Russia's total foreign exchange holdings gone, vanished, in 3 days. Held in New York banks, frozen. Euros held in Frankfurt, frozen. Pounds held in London, frozen. But Russia's gold, 2,299 tons at that moment, worth roughly $140 billion, sitting in vaults, deep inside Moscow, completely, utterly untouchable. This action, unprecedented in scale against a major economy, sends an unmistakable message to every central bank governor on planet Earth. Your foreign currency reserves held in New York, London, or Frankfurt can vanish in 72 hours based on a political decision. Gold stored in your own country cannot. Now, put yourself in the position of a central bank governor in China, India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, or Brazil. You just watched $300 billion disappear. Not because of an economic crisis. Not because of a default, but because of a geopolitical dispute. What do? The unprecedented buying spree. Central banks get the message immediately. By the end of 2022, they've purchased 1,136 tons of gold, the highest annual total since official record-keeping began in 1950. That's double the previous decade's average. 2023 doesn't slow down. They buy another 1,037 tons. And 2024. We're on pace for another 1,000+ ton year. We're not watching careful diversification anymore. We're not watching gradual portfolio adjustments. We're watching preparation. But here's what's truly revealing. Who's buying and who's staying quiet about it. China's shadow accumulation. Let's start with China. The first quarter of 2023 brings something unusual. The People's Bank of China reports adding 102 tons of gold officially, increasing reserves to 2,068 tons by March. This is the first time China has reported monthly gold purchases since 2019. That 4-year gap tells you everything. They weren't reporting their purchases, but they absolutely were buying. Independent analysts who track Swiss export data show China imported approximately 300 tons in 2022 alone, beyond what official reserves indicate. Shanghai Gold Exchange withdrawals, which represent physical gold leaving the exchange in private and institutional hands, totaled over 2,000 tons in 2022. If those numbers are accurate, and there's very good reason to believe that China's true holdings may exceed 4,000 to 5,000 tons. That would make them the second or third largest holder globally, after the United States at 8,133 tons and possibly tied with Germany at 3,355 tons. Why is China hiding the real number? Because revealing massive gold accumulation would drive prices higher before they finish. Buying signal to the world they're preparing for dollar system stress, trigger panic. Among other central banks to front-run their purchases, the Singapore signal then in July 2023, Singapore makes a statement without saying much at all. The Monetary Authority of Singapore reveals its gold holdings increased by 30% to 222 tons. Now, think carefully about what Singapore represents. It's not Russia. It's not China. It's not Turkey. Singapore is a stable, Western-aligned financial hub with one of the strongest currencies in Asia. The Singapore dollar is backed by massive reserves managed with legendary discipline. MAS manages $366 billion in reserves, mostly held in U.S. treasuries and high-grade sovereign bonds. So why is Singapore suddenly buying gold? They won't say it publicly, but the answer is obvious. Portfolio diversification against long-term concentration risk in dollar-denominated assets. When even Singapore rock-solid conservative, Western-aligned Singapore is hedging against the dollar, that tells you something profound about what sophisticated institutions see coming. Poland's bold move. November 2023, Poland's National Bank announces it now holds 420 tons of gold, up from just 103 tons in 2018. Poland has quadrupled its gold reserves in 5 years, and Poland's central bank governor, Adam Glapiński, actually states publicly that the gold provides insurance and independence. He's saying the quiet part out loud. Insurance against what? Independence from what? Insurance against dollar system stress. Independence from relying solely on Western-controlled reserve assets. The mystery buyers. But here's the part that should genuinely alarm you. November 2023, the IMF reports that in the third quarter, central banks purchased 337 tons of gold, but only 139 tons came from identifiable, disclosed sources. That leaves 198 tons, nearly 60% of the total, purchased by central banks, who refuse to disclose their buying. Industry analysts speculate these are Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, Saudi Arabia's central bank, the UAE's central bank, Qatar, or additional Chinese purchases through state-owned banks that don't report directly to international authorities. The pattern is crystal clear. Major nations are accumulating gold quietly, deliberately, and they absolutely do not want markets or geopolitical rivals knowing exactly how much they're holding. The 2024 acceleration from January through September 2024, central banks have purchased 694 tons, putting us on pace for yet another 1,000+ ton year. Poland adds 90 tons, and now holds 420 total. Turkey adds 30 tons. India's Reserve Bank adds 27 tons. China officially adds 29 tons. But again, import data suggests the real number is much higher. Even the Czech National Bank, a small European institution managing just $11.3 billion in reserves, announces purchases of 6 tons. When even small European central banks are diversifying into gold, you're not watching isolated decisions by a few countries. You're watching a systemic shift in how the entire global financial system views reserve assets. The price doesn't matter anymore. But here's what's genuinely unusual about 2024, and this is where you need to pay very close attention. Gold reaches $2,500 per ounce in August, a record high. It briefly touches $2,685 in September. Historically, when gold prices surge, central bank buying slows because these institutions are price sensitive. They buy when gold is cheap and pause when it's expensive. Not this time. Turkey buys at $2,400 per ounce. Poland buys at $2,350. China continues accumulating above $2,300. The price has become secondary to the function they need gold to serve. And that tells you everything about what's really happening here. This isn't about investment returns. This isn't about making money on gold price appreciation. This is about the fundamental architecture of the monetary system itself. Tension hook. So who actually wins and loses as this plays out? And more importantly, what does this mean for you? Stay with me, because this next part is critical. What this means for you, the winners. Let's be completely direct about who wins in this shift. The winners are central banks in emerging and middle-income nations. Russia, China, India, Turkey, Poland, Singapore, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. These are countries outside the dollar's inner circle. They're gaining both geopolitical negotiating leverage and genuine reserve diversification. If dollar dominance erodes gradually over the next 10 or 20 years, and that's increasingly likely, they're positioned to weather that transition without catastrophic currency crisis. Gold mining nations like Australia, Canada, Russia, South Africa, Ghana, and Peru benefit from sustained institutional demand that supports prices regardless of investment flows or economic cycles. And here's an interesting one. Citizens in high-inflation countries actually win. Turkish citizens, for example, privately hold an estimated 3,500 to 5,000 tons of gold in jewelry, coins, and bars accumulated over generations. When Turkey's central bank aggressively accumulates gold, it validates what the population already knows from lived experience. The lira is unreliable, and gold preserves wealth across generations and political crises. The losers, but there are clear, undeniable losers in this shift. The U.S. Treasury market loses marginal liquidity. Every dollar that central banks spend on gold is a dollar not being used to buy us Treasury bonds. When central banks diversify even just 5% to 10% of their reserves from bonds into gold, the marginal buyer supporting our $33 trillion in government debt weakens. That doesn't cause an immediate crisis, but it fundamentally changes the long-term math of how much debt the United States can issue at low interest rates. Dollar hegemony faces slow, steady erosion. Look, the dollar still completely dominates. 88% of foreign exchange transactions use dollars as of 2024. That's not changing overnight. The infrastructure is too deep. The network effects are too strong. But when central banks prepare for dollar system stress by holding gold, they're building infrastructure for a world where dollar dominance is meaningfully reduced, even if it remains the largest single currency. It's not collapse we're talking about. It's erosion over decades. Death by 1,000 cuts, not a sudden heart attack. And American savers holding dollars face a subtle but very real loss. If this diversification contributes to gradual dollar weakness over the next 10 to 20 years, and basic economics says it will, your purchasing power declines while the institutions holding gold preserve theirs. Your retirement account denominated in dollar buys less. Their reserves denominated in gold by the same amount or more. It's a wealth transfer happening in slow motion, from ordinary citizens to sovereign institutions. The warning, let me bring this full circle back to where we started. Remember that August evening in 1971, when President Nixon went on television and broke the promise our country had kept since Bretton Woods? He thought he was solving an immediate crisis, stopping the gold drain from Fort Knox, and he did solve that crisis, but he created a deeper, more fundamental question that took 50 years to fully form in the minds of central bankers worldwide. If currency isn't backed by gold anymore, what actually backs currency? The answer we've all lived with for 5 decades is trust, military power, and network effects. The dollar works because everyone believes it works, because our military guarantees global trade routes, and because the entire system is built around dollar transactions. But central banks buying 1,136 tons in 2022, 1,037 in 2023, and heading for another 1,000 in 2024, aren't panicking about that system. They're asking a different, more nuanced question. What happens when trust frays at the edges? When power becomes more distributed? When the network starts to fragment into regional blocks? When $300 billion can vanish in 72 hours based on a political decision? They're not rejecting the dollar. It's still the dominant reserve currency and will remain so for years, possibly decades. But they're preparing quietly, deliberately, systematically for the day after the next promise breaks, whenever that day comes. The personal implication: you and I can't do what central banks do. We can't buy hundreds of tons of gold and store it in sovereign vaults protected by military guards. But we can understand what they're seeing that makes them act this way. They're looking at $33 trillion in U.S. debt and rising. They're looking at $9 trillion printed in emergency liquidity during COVID. They're looking at unfunded liabilities in Social Security and Medicare exceeding $150 trillion. They're looking at how quickly $300 billion in Russian reserves vanished, and they're concluding that the probability of another systemic break, sometime in the next 10, 20, or 30 years, is high enough to justify moving billions of dollars from bonds into gold right now, even at record prices. That's not a prediction of imminent collapse. That's a recognition that the monetary system we've operated under since 1971 is entering a new phase one where the assumptions that held for 50 years might not hold for the next 50. The institutions with the longest time horizons and the most at stake are repositioning quietly. And they're telling us something profoundly important if we're willing to pay attention. The promise broke once before in 1971. Central banks around the world are making absolutely certain that when it breaks again, and history suggests they won't be the ones left holding paper promises, asking for gold that doesn't exist. The question you need to answer for yourself is simple. Will you? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Are central banks right to prepare for this? And what are you doing to protect yourself? Hit that subscribe button because this story is far from over. I'll see you in the next one.